experiences of the soul after the soul is separated from the body, it's very interesting that this term noetic awareness often comes up. Okay? Now, one point here to make. Do not make this an equation. Very often when we read biblical texts, and the biblical texts talk about pitting the spirit against the flesh. Throughout Christian history, people have read those texts as really referring to the soul pitted against the body. Okay? Now, that's what's led to the kind of dualism that is Platonic or Gnostic in its orientation, rather than what the biblical texts truly say. How many of you have copies of the Bible with you, with the New Testament? If you have one, look up Galatians. Go to Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 5. And I just want to look at one such text as an example of this. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Verse 13. Who would like to read for me? Anyone who would? Well, I better do it because of the microphone, right? Okay. For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another. I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. Now, many people throughout Christian history have read this warfare of spirit versus flesh as a dualism, an antagonism of soul versus body. This is not what St. Paul is saying. Okay? For him, the spirit are those things that the later fathers would talk about, the desires of the nous, the elevated things. The flesh are those impulses of the human being that drag us down into enmeshment in the material, physical world of passions. Okay? But you see, if you misinterpret these biblical injunctions of spirit versus flesh as being the antagonism of soul versus body, you get a kind of dualism that's been very destructive of a proper understanding of anthropology and of death, what happens at death. Okay? So, just to continue with this passage. Verse 19, now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. I tend to use this as my checklist when I go to confession. It works very well. Just as I told you before in times past, and those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. So you see that the spirit and the flesh are the two impulses, the two directions in which the nous can turn. So this is an important distinction between soul versus body on the one hand and spirit versus flesh on the other. Do not equate them. What does all this lead up to? That death for the Orthodox is always an unnatural, in the proper sense of the word, an unnatural occurrence. It flies in the face of the divine plan for human beings. It contradicts the true end, the true telos, the true goal for which human beings are created. And for that reason, it is something that God had to deal with for the sake of our salvation. In short, death is seen as unnatural because it's a disruption of personhood. Because persons are body and soul together, intrinsically linked. If personhood is disrupted, then you have an unnatural situation which God, by His grace, had to remedy. What also does this lead to? It also leads to something that you see throughout the services of the Orthodox Church and in the writings of the Fathers concerning death. Death is a traumatic event in the sense that as the soul leaves the body, it recognizes that it is doing something that it is not meant to do, really. That the soul is meant to be housed in the body, and at death, when soul separates from body, a trauma of sorts occurs. The church, ever solicitous for the welfare of her people in life and death, is there to ease the transition from life into death because of the parting of the soul from the body. And the prayers of the church and the various things, as we'll see in later talks, we do these things because this transition can be mollified. And the person can be comforted in this otherwise traumatic occurrence of death. Okay. Let me turn now to something that's gotten a lot of press and most of you have heard about, and that's near-death experiences. All right? Father Seraphim Rose, in his book, talks about near-death experiences, and he has the attitude that even though one must be wary of these things, they reveal something very positive about the continuation of life after death. Now, most of you have heard about these things, and I want to read you just one example of a near-death experience, and all the others I've read are basically variations on this theme. Okay? On a hospital bed, a man lies in the throes of dying. He hears his doctor pronounce him dead. He then hears a buzzing sound and feels himself rushing through a long, dark tunnel. Now, from a distance, he looks down at his own body and sees the doctor trying to revive it. He becomes aware that he is in a body different from the one on the bed. Now he sees the spirits of dead relatives and friends coming to welcome him. Then a radiant being of light appears to him. Without speaking, the being lovingly asks how he has lived his life and helps him to evaluate it by showing him a replay of key experiences. Next, he comes to a border that seems to be the line between earthly life and the afterlife. He now realizes he has to go back. His time to die has not yet arrived. He is engulfed by deep feelings of love and joy and resists returning to earth. But he does return somehow and finds himself back in his physical body. Later on, released from the hospital, he learns not to talk about the experience. It is hard to describe, and people show negative reactions to such talk. Still, his life is not the same as before. He is happier and more loving, and he no longer fears dying. Now, all of you have heard of this kind of experience, right? This near-death experience. It happens when clinical death, the stopping of breathing, the stopping of heartbeat happens, and it sometimes happens in life-threatening situations. In a book by Dr. Kenneth Ring, he pinpoints all the elements of these near-death experiences. They sometimes differ in sequence, they differ in patterns, but basically they're all there. The ironic thing is that people who have these near-death experiences and report them come from all kinds of different religious backgrounds. Some of them are even agnostics and atheists. Okay? So this is what has led psychologists to study these phenomena. Now, these are really sort of unsettling in a number of ways, and it has led people who have done an orthodox analysis of death to look at these near-death experiences. One more aspect of sort of the clinical data that has led Orthodox theologians to examine this topic. Not only do you have these near-death experiences, NDEs, you also have a number of data, not only from clinical sources, but also from the writings of the saints. All right? Deathbed visions. When people are at the point of death, there seems to be a perception of a spiritual reality beyond what they're experiencing in the body. Okay? Now, let me just read you an example of that, one of those. A 70-year-old patient had seen her deceased husband several times, and then she predicted her own death. She said that her husband had appeared in the window and motioned to her to come out of the house. The reason for his visits was to have her join him. Her daughter and other relatives were present when she predicted her death, laid out her burial clothes, laid down on her bed all of the things she had prepared for her funeral. She herself lay down and died 1 hour later. She seemed calmed, resigned to death, and in fact wanted to die. Before she saw her husband, she didn't speak about imminent death. Her doctor was so surprised by her sudden death, for which there was no sufficient medical reason, that he checked if she had poisoned herself. He found neither signs of poisoning nor any such drugs in the house. As a priest, attending to people on their deathbed, I myself have had experiences like this, where people who are on the verge of death clearly perceive something beyond their present experience. I had a very odd experience with my own uncle's death. My uncle, my godfather, as a matter of fact, was my father's brother, very close to my father. And I went to see him in the hospital. And as I was talking to him, he seemed to be perfectly clear. And he kept calling me by my father's name. And I says, Uncle Fats, because it was his nickname, Uncle Fats. It's Ted. He says, but your father's been here all day. My father had died before. And sure enough, he died the next day. Now, was it just hallucination? Who knows? All right. Now, I want to give these two kinds of experiences to show what the various writers in Orthodox circles have done to explain these rather heartening experiences that people have that seem to point very clearly to the continuation of consciousness and life after death. What's the first reaction that people have? Well, Father Lazar, now Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, Father Lev Puhalo, says that these are demonic illusions. He sees these things as demonic and not as real at all. All right? Now, I'm not going to agree completely with his stance, but let me lay it out to you as fairly as I can. Here's his way of thinking. He says, according to Orthodox anthropology, the reason we're able to see, the reason we're able to hear, the reason we're able to feel ourselves in the presence of other people is because the soul is in the body. Okay? If the soul were really separated from the body, the soul would not be able to see things or hear things or report the things, the kind of sensual images and data that people in near-death experiences seem to talk about. So, according to Archbishop Lazar, these are something that are not to be taken seriously and to be rejected completely. He says this, the point is certainly obvious. The nous, here we go, the nous, the soul's chief faculty of spiritual awareness must remain inside the body, the temple of God, in order to be delivered from the wiles of the demons and their delusions and fantasies. The revelations which the saints received, they received within, in the kingdom of God, not without, in the realm of demons. So he says, as soon as the spirit separates from the body, it is subject to demonic assault and for the kind of false impressions that these near-death experiences report. For the kingdom of God and the vision, therefore, of that kingdom is within. All these other things, out-of-the-body experiences, psychic phenomena, astral projection, and so forth, all have as their chief step the exit of the mind from the body, where they are subject to diverse demonic fantasies. As we have already said, the soul, or mind, the meaning here is the same, cannot exit the body, but the imagination and emotions can be projected outward and are easily subject to demonic influences which are then brought into the mind. Okay, so he has a basically negative approach to this. Father Seraphim Rose, on the other hand, was not quite so negative. He says there's something real here, something that is perceived at the point of death, where the crossing of a border between strictly material reality and the spiritual reality is something that's being experienced by the person at that point. And how does one adjudicate between these two positions? Archbishop Lazar Puhalo's position and Father Seraphim Rose. Well, thank goodness we have Metropolitan Hierotheos, who in his great theological mind and his patristic sensibility has said some very interesting things. And he finds some strength in these near-death experiences because they are reflected in hagiography, the writings concerning the saints. Let me just read to you a section from his book where he deals with this. How do you explain near-death experiences and these deathbed visions? How are they to be understood from an Orthodox point of view? He says this: during my pastoral service, I have heard many people tell of similar incidents. Sometimes they were their own experiences during serious illnesses, and at other times they were testimonies of their own people whom they were watching. As a youngster, I was witness to an incident in which a woman, approaching the end of her life, when her soul was leaving her body, uttered a groan, and at the same time was shaking her fist as if she were chastising someone and chasing them away. One can hear about such events on the Holy Mountain. Various fathers of Mount Athos have told me incidents from the final moments of holy and sinful monks. Let me give a personal witness from the illness of my ever-memorable Gerondas, Metropolitan Kalinikos of Edessa, which bears on the subject of this chapter. After an operation to remove a brain tumor, there was a hemorrhage, and he fell into a deep coma. The doctors attending him said that he was on the border of life and death. His heart was functioning, but he was breathing with a mechanical apparatus. If the inflow of air were to stop, he would die. Everything was probable: to remain a vegetable, to die, or to recover consciousness. When he recovered consciousness after a few days, he weepingly and with great stress recounted a dreadful incident. He said that it was not a dream, but a real event. He was aware that this was a reality. He saw himself outside his body. His soul was watching his body, which lay on his bed, and was also watching all of us who felt pity and were preparing for a funeral. Indeed, he pointed out one particular nurse among the many was there, and he was measuring him for the coffin. He didn't like that too much, but he knew it was happening. He understood that his soul had gone out of his body, and indeed he said that at that hour he himself was saying the funeral prayer for the dead to himself. He also had other such experiences, but the one which I just mentioned was the most expressive and relative to the topic we are discussing. I do not actually know whether it was an out-of-the-body experience or an experience close to death. The fact is that it was an unfamiliar state. Okay? And this is the way he sort of arrives at some kind of coalescence, some kind of consonance between these views. Something happens at death where the soul enters a different state of existence. If the proper abode of the soul is in the body, if it is through the body that the soul perceives the world, if it is through the body that the soul sees and hears and interacts with the material world, if it is because of its dwelling in the body that the soul is able to exercise its mental faculties, when the soul is separated from the body, there is still a consciousness that is a different state of existence. Okay? And these incidences from clinical data and from the lives of the saints seem to indicate clearly that there is some continuation of consciousness, a noetic awareness that continues. Let me just say one last remark before I conclude this section of the talk and ask you for questions. If you look at some of the medical data, there are people who say these are just hallucinations. Near the time of death, the body is really sort of short-circuiting in a lot of ways. The normal functioning of synapses, the normal metabolic functions are in a different state, an altered state of some sort, and these are hallucinatory things of a person who's undergoing these chemical changes, biochemical changes in the body. But that does not explain one thing about these. Why, if they're just hallucinations, if you had hallucinations and I had hallucinations, our respective hallucinations would be determined by our life experiences. Okay? For instance, I predict I have nightmares about black bears after I leave Alaska. I would not have had those nightmares if I had not come here. Okay? But the fact is, if you look at these near-death experiences and deathbed visions, you see that across cultures, in different religious traditions, the farthest separated corners of the world, the 11 elements that I was discussing, as outlined by one of those doctors, is present in virtually all of them. Okay? So, the idea that this is just an hallucination doesn't really explain this common material that you find cross-culturally and cross-religiously. It seems that there might be some spiritual reality that is perceived here, and when people describe these things, that's why you have these common elements in these descriptions. Okay? So, the basic points I want to make in this first part of the talk this evening, and we'll come back for the second after a short break, is that the foundation of understanding death from an Orthodox perspective is understanding the human being correctly. And the understanding of the human being correctly is that we are psychophysical unities. We are created as body and soul together. All right? Death violates this creation of the person as God wanted it to exist, and that means that death is an unnatural kind of development that God had to address because it violated his very purpose and created human beings as who they are. We have to keep in mind that in our ideas of death and of Christianity, that the purpose of the faith is to save us whole, completely, body and soul together. The purpose of salvation is to save you, save your body, save your soul, not just your soul. And so these kind of dualistic, Gnostic, Platonic, more philosophical than theological understandings of the human being, once and for all have to be put aside so that we can understand why the church teaches what it does about death, how it prepares us for death, what it says happens after death, and why it conducts the various stages of preparing someone for death and praying for them afterwards. That's what we'll continue in the next three talks. Just to give you a snapshot of these next three talks, we'll continue to look at some of the indications of what the church believes happens to the soul in separation from the body at the moment of death. And then we're going to look at the larger cosmic effects of death and why God had to actually step in the economy of salvation, in the great sort of plan of salvation that God enacted in the world. Why, as that professor of mine at Notre Dame said, death was the enemy. And death is what had to be focused on as the foe to be conquered. Why is that in a larger theological sense? And it doesn't just have to do with human beings. That's the point we'll see. So let me stop at this point. Do we want to take some questions now and then break for coffee?
Why don't we break it?
Okay, why don't you, if you have questions, sort of formulate them in your mind, have some coffee. We'll start the second part tonight with questions and I'll conclude my talk for this evening. Of course.